Welcome to the Deep Dives, where we, try to strip away the noise and get straight to the evidence. Today we're doing something a bit different. We aren't just discussing ancient Indian history. We are diving deep into the actual raw materials that historians use.
Exactly. It's a crucial mission, really, because ancient history isn't just a neat story someone found. It's this painstaking process of interpretation. Think of it like trying to piece together a shattered mirror, one that gives you a really distorted reflection.
And for you, the listener, understanding how we know what we know the evidence itself that's maybe more powerful than just memorizing dates and names.
Absolutely. We have to grapple with what the past actually left behind for us and why those things survived and not others.
Right, and that focus on method, on the how, is why we really need to start with a story about history writing itself, specifically Kalhana.
Kahana, 12th century Kashmir, often called India's first proper historian.
Because of his incredible work, the Raja Taranjini.
What's so fascinating about him is his ambition. It sounds incredibly modern, even though he was writing centuries ago. He apparently spent 2 whole years on this project, and he looked at everything he could find.
Like what? What kind of sources?
Oh, you name it. Royal chronicles, older manuscripts he could track down, inscriptions on stone or copper plates, coins, even standing monuments and ruins, a really comprehensive approach.
And his goal, the mission he set himself. It's striking. He wanted to recount events like a judge.
Without bias or prejudice. That's his phrase.
That sounds exactly like what a historian today would aim for.
It does, doesn't it? But, and this is the crucial but, when you actually read the Raja Taranjini, you immediately see the difference between his world and ours. Despite those noble goals about method, his narrative weaves together fact and legend constantly. He'll often explain a political disaster or a military victory by pointing to, fate, or a divine curse, or a blessing.
Okay, so he was maybe more like a poet, trying to capture the past vividly. But his fundamental understanding of cause and effect was just different, included the divine as a real actor.
Precisely. And that tension really highlights the challenge for historians today. We have to acknowledge the past is messy, full of different viewpoints, often conflicting ones. Our job is to bridge that gap between that 12th century view where fate is a historical force and our modern critical approach. We're always trying to get as close as possible to what might have happened, using all the scattered evidence we have.
Which means we need a clear way to think about that evidence. The standard approach is to divide sources into 2 big buckets, literary and archaeological.
That's the conventional starting point. Literary is basically all texts, long, short, written down originally, or even stuff that started orally, like chants or epics. And archaeological is all the tangible stuff, the material remains. Buildings, tools, pottery, bones, coins, the physical leftovers of life.
But it's not always a clean split, is it? And this is where we hit our first, maybe, aha moment.
Not at all. The overlap is huge, actually. Think about it. What's an inscription on a stone pillar? Or a king's grant etched onto copper plates?
Okay, yeah. It's a physical object, archaeological, but it's also text, literary.
Exactly. Or a coin with a king's name and titles, or even an old palm leaf manuscript. These things are simultaneously material objects you can date and analyze physically, and they are texts you have to read, translate, and interpret linguistically.
So you need both toolkits, the archaeologists and the linguists.
You absolutely do. You can't fully decode them otherwise.
All right, let's dive into those literary sources first. When we look at the really old texts, we immediately realize we're not getting a clear photograph of the society. It's more like
a refracted image. That's a good way to put it. The information has passed through so many filters: memory, oral transmission, the scribe's own choices, maybe later editors.
And that filtering's even stronger because of how they were first used, right?
Yeah.
Many were meant just for reading.
Definitely. Think about the earliest religious texts, like the Vedas. Their primary purpose wasn't to document history, it was performative. They were meant to be memorized, recited out loud, heard by the community, performed as part of rituals. They lived in sound for centuries.
Passed down orally, generation after generation, before anyone wrote them down.
Exactly. And that whole process prioritizes getting the ritual right, preserving the tradition, maybe the meter and sound, not necessarily objective historical fact.
And even when they did get written down, the sheer effort involved. It wasn't like firing up a printing press.
Oh, absolutely not. We really need to talk about the physicality of it, the materiality of the manuscripts. This was high-craft, low-volume production.
So walk us through it. What were they writing on? Not paper, obviously.
No, mostly palm leaves, specific types, usually talipot or palmyra palm.
Palm leaves? How durable is that?
Well, the talipot leaf was the preferred choice. It could be quite large, maybe 90 centimeters long, 8 or 9 wide, and crucially, it was thinner, more flexible, and surprisingly durable if prepared and stored correctly.
90 centimeters.
Hmm.
That's almost a meter long. A big writing surface. How did they turn that into a book?
They'd cut the leaves to a standard size, dry them carefully, and then punch holes, usually 1, 2, or sometimes 3 near the edge. Then they'd thread a cord through the holes to string the leaves together into a bundle called a pothy, and to protect this stack, they used covers,
Covers made of.
often wood, sometimes dried palm petioles, or for really fancy manuscripts, maybe even carved ivory.
Okay, so they've got the pages and the cover. How did they actually write? You can't just use ink on a palm leaf, can you?
Not easily, no. It wasn't painting ink on, it was actually an engraving process. They used a sharp metal stylus to carefully scratch or carve the letters into the surface of the leaf. This left a very fine, shallow groove.
But wouldn't that be hard to read? Just faint scratches.
It would be. So the next step was crucial. They'd smear the entire leaf surface with a mixture of soot lampblack, basically, or powdered charcoal, mixed with some kind of vegetable juice or oil to make a paste.
Ah, I see. The paste would sink into the grooves.
Exactly, and then they'd wipe the excess off the surface. What you're left with is the dark paste filling the engraved letters, making them stand out clearly against the lighter background of the palm leaf.
That's incredibly labor-intensive. Carve first, then rub in the ink. Huge potential for errors when copying too, I imagine.
Huge. And think about preservation. These are organic materials in often tropical climates. Keeping them safe was a constant battle. It was basically archival science before the term existed.
What did that involve? Keeping bugs away.
Bugs, mold, humidity, all of it. Manuscripts needed regular cleaning, sometimes fumigation, maybe using substances like thymol. Insecticides were essential.
And physical damage.
Yeah.
Leaves cracking or splitting.
That required careful repair. Specialists would use very thin, special paper and adhesives that were stable, but also reversible things like PVA or methyl cellulose mixed pastes, archival quality stuff, even back then. And then often they'd lightly oil the leaves, maybe with something like citronella oil, to keep them flexible, polish them up, and restring the whole pothic.
It's just amazing that this tradition of scribes copying and recopying these texts lasted for so many centuries.
It really is. It only seriously declined during the 19th century when the printing press finally took over.
Which means there must be thousands, maybe tens of thousands of these manuscripts still out there, unread, unstudied.
Exactly. The past is literally sitting in stacks of palm leaves in archives and monasteries, which brings us to the big intellectual challenge. How do we actually use these texts for history?
Right, because the copy we have might be from, say, the 15th century,
Right.
but the text itself could have been composed when?
Centuries earlier, often hundreds of years. And authorship is another headache. Many early texts weren't written by a single person. They're often the product of generations of anonymous authors, compilers, editors, layers upon layers of material.
So for historians, the job is to peel back those layers, figure out who wrote what, when, and maybe why.
Precisely. We have to constantly ask, what's the potential bias here? Is this text coming from a priestly class, a royal court, a merchant group? What's their agenda? What religious tradition do they belong to? Are they writing from a city perspective or a rural one?
And crucially, what kind of text is it? A poem isn't the legal code. A myth isn't a chronicle.
Absolutely critical. You have to be sensitive to genre. So many of these texts represent an ideal. Think about law books describing perfect social order. That's often prescriptive, not descriptive. It's what the authors, usually elite brahmanas, wanted society to be like, not necessarily how it actually was.
So don't confuse the rule book with the reality on the ground.
Never. And myths. They aren't history in a factual sense, but they tell us enormous amounts about the values, beliefs, social structures, and anxieties of the people who told and retold them. You just need that critical distance.
Okay, let's get into some of the major textual traditions then. We've got different language families, Indo-European like Sanskrit and the Prakrits, Dravidian like Tamil down south.
And others too, Austroasiatic, Tibeto-Burman. A complex linguistic map. But the oldest surviving texts we have are the Vedas in Sanskrit, and the earliest Tamil literature.
Before we dive into the specifics, you mentioned something important earlier, this idea that the modern split between religious and secular doesn't really map onto ancient India.
It really doesn't. It's an anachronism we have to be careful of. Take a core concept like dharma. We often translate it simply as religion, but it was so much broader. It meant cosmic order, righteous conduct, social duty according to your station, law, virtue. A whole way of life. So texts we might label religious are often packed with information about kingship, administration, social norms, geography, even medicine or grammar. The categories bled into each other.
Okay, that's a crucial lens to keep in mind. Let's start with the absolute foundation, the Vedas. Veda just means knowledge, right?
Correct. And these texts have a unique status. Shruti, that means that which has been heard.
Heard from whom?
Not composed by humans, according to tradition. They are considered eternal truths, revealed to or heard by ancient inspired sages, the rishis. This divine origin gives them ultimate authority, setting them apart from all later texts.
And those later texts are called?
Smriti, which means that which is remembered. This includes everything else, the law books, Dharmashastra, the epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Puranas, all considered human compositions based on remembered tradition and therefore subordinate to the Shruti Vedas.
We usually talk about the four Vedas. Can you break those down?
Sure. The oldest is the Rig Veda. It's essentially a collection, a samhita of 1,028 hymns, mostly prayers and praises to various deities. It's some of the oldest poetry surviving anywhere in the world.
Incredible. And the others?
The Samaveda takes hymns, mainly from the Rig Veda, and sets them to melodies. It's basically the musical handbook for chanting during sacrifices. The Yajur Veda provides the prose formulas and ritual instructions, the how-to manual for performing the sacrifices correctly, and the Atharva Veda is the latest of the four. It's a bit different. It contains hymns, but also spells, charms for healing or protection, magical incantations. It gives us a much better glimpse into popular beliefs and everyday concerns beyond the elite sacrificial cult.
But it gets even more complicated because each Veda isn't just one book, right? There are layers within each one.
That's right. Each of the four Vedas is traditionally divided into four sections or types of text. First, you have the Samhita, which is the core collection of hymns or mantras we just talked about. Second, the Brahmanas. These are later prose texts attached to each Samhita, and they explain the meaning and procedures of the complex sacrificial rituals in great detail. Lots of theological speculation here. Third, the Aranyakas, or forest treatises. These seem to bridge the gap between the ritualism of the Brahmanas and the philosophy of the Upanishads. They often discuss the symbolic meaning of rituals, perhaps for ascetics living away from settlements. And finally, the Upanishads. These are the philosophical texts appearing towards the end of the Vedic period. They explore fundamental questions about reality, the self, Atman, the ultimate reality, Brahman, and the relationship between them, really the foundation for much of later Indian philosophy.
Okay, that's a lot of layers. What about dating all this? Rig Veda especially seems to have wildly different proposed dates.
Oh, the dating is notoriously difficult. You'll see claims for the Rig Veda going back as far as 6000 BCE, often based on astronomical references, which are, let's say, debatable. Others place it much later. Most historians today work with a more cautious chronology, largely based on linguistic analysis, how the language changes over time, and the geographical areas mentioned.
So what's the generally accepted range?
The common working framework, often traced back to Max Miller's initial attempts, but refined since, places the composition of the main Rig Veda hymns the early Vedic period roughly between 1500 and 1000 BCE. The later Vedic period, when the other three Vedas, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and the earliest Upanishads were likely composed, is usually placed from about 1000 to 500 BCE. But these are broad estimates.
And these texts mainly tell us about?
Primarily, they reflect the worldview, rituals, and social structure of the Indo-Aryan speaking groups, particularly the Brahmanical priestly class. Direct references to specific historical events are actually quite rare, especially in the earlier parts.
And just to add another layer of complexity, there wasn't just one version of each Veda being passed down, was there?
No, not at all. Different priestly schools or lineages, called shakas or charanas, preserved slightly different versions or recensions of the texts, and especially of the rituals associated with them.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take the Yajur Veda, the one focused on ritual procedure. It famously split into two main branches, the Shukla, or white Yajur Veda, and the Krishna, or black Yajur Veda. The key difference for us is how they present the material. The White Yajur Veda Samhita contains only the mantras, the sacred formulas to be recited, clear separation. But the Black Yajur Veda schools interweave the mantras with Brahmana-style prose commentary within the Samhita itself. So you get the formula, and right next to it, discussion about its meaning, its application, variations in the ritual.
Ah, so for a historian studying how rituals evolved or were debated.
The Black Yajur Veda is incredibly valuable because the commentary itself becomes part of the historical evidence, showing intellectual activity and interpretation happening right alongside the transmission of the core text.
Okay, let's move from the Vedas to the great epics. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata, these are huge, sprawling works.
Absolutely massive. And because they grew over such a long period, the old idea of a single epic age is really obsolete now. We're talking centuries of composition and accretion for both.
What are the rough dates for their main development?
For the Mahabharata, the main period of composition and expansion is generally put between about 400 BCE and 400 CE, a huge time frame. The Ramayana seems to have started a bit earlier, maybe 5th or 4th century BCE, and reached something like its current form by the 3rd century CE. Again, very long gestation periods. And they clearly knew about each other. There are cross-references.
Interestingly, there's a suggestion, based on internal evidence, the societies they depict, that the Mahabharata might reflect a slightly earlier social stage than the Ramayana. How does that work?
There are a couple of main lines of argument. One is geography. The core action of the Mahabharata is set in the Kuru-Panchala region. That's the Indo-Gangetic divide, the upper Ganga Valley. This aligns with earlier phases of settlement and political power. The Ramayana's center of gravity seems to have shifted eastward to the middle Ganga Valley, Kosala and Videha, which reflects a later historical development.
And the other line of argument?
It relates to social norms, particularly concerning women. The Mahabharata features some very strong, assertive female characters, Draupadi, Kunti, Gandhari. And critically, it accepts, or at least depicts without condemnation, the practice of niyoga.
Let's just clarify niyoga for listeners.
Right. Niyoga was a custom allowed under specific circumstances where if a husband was impotent or died without an heir, his wife could be permitted, sometimes instructed, to have intercourse with a designated close male relative, usually his brother, or sometimes a revered sage, purely for the purpose of conceiving a son to continue the lineage. The Pandava brothers themselves are born through a form of this.
Okay, so the Mahabharata includes this. How does the Ramayana compare?
The Ramayana generally depicts a society with stricter controls over women's conduct and sexuality. Sita's trial by fire is a famous example. The relative acceptance of niyoga in the Mahabharata is often seen as suggesting a less rigid, perhaps earlier, social structure compared to the more codified patriarchy reflected in the Ramayana.
The Mahabharata is just colossal 18 books, or parvas. It feels like it became a repository for everything. How do historians even begin to untangle the original story, the war between the Pandavas and Kauravas, from all the added material?
It's a huge challenge. The core narrative of the dynastic struggle is definitely there, but it's embedded within this vast encyclopedic collection of myths, genealogies, philosophical discourses, statecraft advice, law codes, you name it. Think of famous sections like the Bhagavad Gita or the massive Shanti Parva with Bhishma's long sermons on kingship and dharma from his deathbed of arrows. These are clearly later additions layered onto the original heroic story.
So how do you separate them? Linguistic style, ideas?
All of the above. Scholars look at linguistic features, older versus newer forms of Sanskrit. They analyze the philosophical concepts. Are they early Vedic, or do they reflect later developments like devotional bhakti ideas? They look for inconsistencies in the narrative. It's a process of literary archaeology in a way.
And the central event, the Great War itself, any historical basis?
Well, the epic narrative describes a massive, decisive conflict. Whether a single war of that specific scale happened exactly as described is impossible to prove historically. However, archaeological evidence from the region, which we'll get to, does suggest that there were conflicts and shifts in settlement around the time the epic tradition might place its core events, maybe around 1000 BCE. So perhaps a memory of real, smaller-scale tribal conflicts got magnified over centuries into the epic war.
The Ramayana, in contrast, feels a bit more unified, maybe closer to a single author's vision, traditionally Valmiki.
It does have a more cohesive narrative structure and a generally more consistent style, which leads many to think its core story might stem from a single poetic vision. But even the Ramayana wasn't static. It grew and changed dramatically over time.
How so? Can we trace stages in its development too?
Yes, scholars like John Brockington have proposed models identifying several stages. Stage 1, maybe 5th to 4th century BCE, is likely the original heroic ballad, a simpler story, smaller scale. But by stage 3, perhaps between the 1st and 3rd century CE, the text reflects major societal changes. You see references to expanding urbanization, the 4 Varnas, social classes, are more clearly defined. Major deities like Vishnu and Shiva become prominent. The context is different. And then in the later stages, 4 and V, the theological aspects become much stronger. Rama's divinity is emphasized. He's explicitly identified as an avatar of Vishnu. The text transforms from primarily a heroic epic into a central scripture of Vaishnavism.
This brings us right to that tricky point, connecting these epic narratives to archaeology. You mentioned evidence around Kurukshetra.
Right. This is where we see both the potential and the limitations. Sites mentioned prominently in the Mahabharata, Hastinapura, the Kuru capital, Kurukshetra, the battlefield, and others have been excavated. And in layers dating roughly to the period around 1100 to 800 BCE, archaeologists consistently find a distinctive type of pottery called painted grayware, or PGW.
PGW culture. What was their lifestyle like?
Based on the finds associated with PGW remains of mud brick houses, animal bones, cattle, horse, pig, some agricultural tools, and crucially, early evidence of iron use in the later PGW levels, these people seem to have lived a mixed pastoral and agricultural life.
Which matches the general lifestyle described in the early parts of the Mahabharata.
It does fit quite well. So archaeology confirms people were living in the right places at roughly the right time, in a manner consistent with the epic setting.
And here's the big but.
But the pottery can't tell us if the Pandavas won a war against the Kauravas. Archaeology reveals general patterns of material culture, settlement, subsistence. It shows long-term processes. It's very, very difficult, usually impossible, for archaeology to prove or disprove specific events or the existence of specific individuals mentioned in literary texts. That gap remains.
Okay, moving on from the epics, we have the Puranas. The word means old, right? Traditionally also linked to Vyasa, like the Mahabharata.
Yes, ancient lore might be a good translation. Tradition credits Vyasa with compiling them. There are said to be 18 Mahapuranas, or Great Puranas, plus numerous lesser ones. They are truly encyclopedic.
And they have a defining structure, these 5 topics. The Panchalakshana.
That's the classic definition, though not all Puranas cover all 5 topics equally. The 5 are Sarga, primary creation of the universe; Pratisarga, dissolution and recreation; Vamsha, genealogies of gods and sages; Manvantara, the great epochs of time ruled by different manas; and the 5th one, crucial for historians, Vamshanucharita.
Vamshanucharita, that's the genealogies of kings.
Exactly, dynastic lists. And this is where the Puranas, despite being primarily religious texts filled with myths and legends, preserve genuine historical information, especially for later periods.
Which periods are they most useful for?
Particularly for the dynasties ruling in North India, during what the texts call the Kali Yuga, the current degenerate age. They often present these lists in the future tense as prophecies. Such and such king will rule for so many years, then his son will rule. But these sections contain genealogies and reign lengths for historical dynasties like the Haryankas, Shishunagas, Nandas, Mauryas, Shungas, Satavahanas, and importantly, the Guptas. Cross-referencing these lists with inscriptions and coins is fundamental for reconstructing political history.
And the fact that the Puranic lists seem to peter out after the early Guptas, that helps date the Puranas themselves.
It provides a rough terminus ad quem, a date after which they likely weren't significantly updated. Suggests the main compilation phase for many Mahapuranas might have been around the Gupta period, 4th to 6th centuries CE, though they contain much older material and were added to later as well.
Okay. And rounding out the Smriti literature, we have the Dharmashastra, the texts on Dharma.
Right. These are the treatises on righteous conduct, duty, law. They are broadly divided into the earlier Dharma Sutras, written in prose aphorisms, sutras maybe dating from 600 to 300 BCE, and the later Smritis proper, composed in verse, shlokas, like the famous Manu Smriti, Laws of Manu, perhaps dating from 200 BCE to 200 CE, with others compiled as late as 900 CE.
And their goal was to define the ideal path in life.
Yes, balancing the different aims of life, artha, wealth, power, kama, leisure, desire, and moksha, spiritual liberation, all within the overarching framework of dharma, duty, righteousness, according to one's social position. They lay out rules for the 4 varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and the 4 ashramas, or life stages, student, householder, forest dweller, renunciant. Though we should remember this ashrama system was primarily a Brahmanical ideal, probably not followed strictly by most people.
But the real goldmine for historians here isn't just the ideal they describe, but the glimpses we get of reality when the texts seem to grapple with practices that don't quite fit the ideal. You had some great examples from Manu Smriti.
Yes, the Manu Smriti is fascinating for this tension. It shows how the Brahmanical legal system tried to be comprehensive and regulate things, even things it disapproved of. Take marriage rules. Manu strongly condemns marriage between cross cousins, which was common in South India. Yet, centuries later, a major commentator, Madhava, writing in the 14th century in the South, actually defended the practice. He argued that established local custom, Deshachara, was a valid source of dharma and could override the Smriti prohibition in that specific region.
So the system had some built-in flexibility.
Yeah.
or acknowledged regional variation.
It had to. It shows the law wasn't monolithic. Custom could hold significant weight. Another example. Manerd forbids a man of the twice-born Varnas marrying a Shudra woman, calling it undesirable. But in the very same text, in the sections on inheritance, Manu carefully specifies the exact shares of property that sons born from such a union should receive, compared to sons from wives of approved Varnas.
Why legislate for something you forbid?
Because it was happening. People weren't always following the rules. The lawmakers couldn't just ignore the social reality. So they tried to regulate it, to manage it, to fit it into the system somehow, even while expressing disapproval. These moments of reluctant acknowledgement are incredibly revealing about actual social practices. The Dharma Shastras were trying to shape reality, but they also had to react to it.
Okay, so the Vedas, epics, Puranas, Dharma Shastras, that gives us the Brahmanical perspective, but that's only part of the picture. We absolutely need the non-Brahmanical traditions, Buddhist and Jaina literature, for a fuller view.
Crucial counterpoints. They offer completely different perspectives on society, philosophy, the role of kingship, the importance of trade and urban centers, the nature of the self, everything really.
Let's start with Buddhist literature. The main collection is the Tipitaka, the Three Baskets.
That's the Pali Canon, revered especially in the Theravada tradition. The three baskets are the Sutta Pitaka, which contains the discourses and sermons attributed to the Buddha himself and some disciples, the Vinaya Pitaka, which lays out the extensive rules and regulations for the monastic community, the Sangha, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is a later, highly systematic and philosophical analysis of Buddhist doctrine.
When was this canon compiled?
The core teachings obviously go back to the Buddha in the 5th century BCE. The texts were transmitted orally for a long time. Tradition holds they were first written down in Pali in Sri Lanka during the 1st century BCE, but the composition period for the core material stretches from the 5th down to perhaps the 3rd century BCE.
Beyond the core doctrines, what's their value for historians? Texts like the Jatakas.
Immense value. The Jatakas, for instance, are stories about the Buddha's previous lives. While they're didactic tales meant to illustrate virtues, they are set in what seems to be the everyday world of ancient India. They're full of incidental details about villages, cities, kings, merchants, artisans, guilds, social customs, trade routes. A rich source for social and economic history.
And they offer unique voices too, right? You mentioned the Therigatha.
Yes, the Therigatha verses of the elder nuns is remarkable. It's a collection of poems attributed to early Buddhist nuns, expressing their struggles, their reasons for renouncing worldly life, their experiences of meditation, and their attainment of enlightenment. We hear voices like Ubiri lamenting the death of her daughter before finding peace in the Dharma, or Mitta describing her journey. It's one of the very few texts from ancient India giving us direct access to women's spiritual lives and experiences, and from a non-Brahmanical perspective.
And Buddhist texts also tell us a lot about politics, especially royal patronage.
Absolutely. The relationship between the Sangha and political power was crucial. Figures like King Ashoka Maurya, who famously converted to Buddhism and sponsored its spread, feature prominently in Buddhist chronicles and legends. These texts give us insight into how religious movements interacted with state power.
Okay, what about Jaina literature? What are their key texts?
The sacred books of the Jainas are collectively called the Agama Sutras, or Siddhanta. The earliest strata are composed in an Ardha-Magadhi Prakrit dialect. Like the Buddhist canon, these were also preserved orally for a long time. The Shvetambara sect, one of the two main Jaina branches, held a major council at Vallabhi in Gujarat in the 5th or maybe 6th century CE, where they compiled and wrote down their version of the canon. The Digambara sect disputes the authenticity of this canon.
And similar to the Puranas, they have their own narrative traditions.
They do. They have Jaina Puranas and Charitas, which are biographies or hagiographies of the Tirthamakas, the great Jaina teachers like Mahavira, and other important figures. For example, the 8th century Harivamsa Purana by Janasena gives a Jaina retelling of the story of Krishna and the figures from the Mahabharata, integrating them into a Jaina cosmological and ethical framework. It shows how different religious groups were constantly interacting with and reinterpreting the shared epic narratives of India.
Fascinating. Now let's shift focus geographically down south to the earliest Tamil literature, the Sangam corpus.
Right, the Sangam literature is the earliest substantial body of secular literature from South India, composed roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE. As Sangam refers to the legends of ancient assemblies or academies of poets in Madurai.
And it's known for its thematic division.
Yes, into Akam and Puram. Akam poems deal with the interior world, love, relationships, emotions using a highly conventionalized system of landscapes and symbols. Puram poems deal with the exterior world, kingship, warfare, heroism, death, community life, ethics. This literature is absolutely invaluable for understanding the society, polity, and culture of the Tamil chiefdoms, the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas before the rise of larger kingdoms. It gives a very different flavor from the Sanskrit texts of the north.
And following the Sangam period, we get the great Tamil epics.
Yes, the two most famous are the Silappatikaram, the Tale of the Anklet, and the Manimekalai. They probably date to the centuries immediately following the Sangam age, maybe 5th, 6th centuries CE.
And they show the growing influence of Buddhism and Jainism in the south.
Definitely. The Silappatikaram, attributed to a Chera prince who supposedly became a Jaina monk, Ilongo Adigal, tells the tragic story of Kanaki and her merchant husband Kovalan. It involves infidelity, a wrongful execution, Kanaki's fiery destruction of Madurai in revenge, and her eventual deification as a goddess of chastity. While incorporating local traditions, it has a noticeable Jaina ethical tone. The Manimekalai, considered a sequel, focuses on the daughter of Kovalan and the dancer Matavi. It has a very strong Buddhist message. The heroine, Manimekalai, rejects worldly life, becomes a nun, learns Buddhist philosophy, and travels around using a magical alms bowl that never empties to feed the poor. The two epics together show the vibrant, sometimes competing religious dynamics of the Tamil region at the time.
Beyond these major religious and regional traditions, we also have a wealth of other literature, court poetry, drama, technical treatises.
Absolutely. We have the celebrated plays and poems of Kalidasa associated with the Gupta period, maybe 4th, 5th CCE. Other important playwrights like Basa, Shudraka Mechakatika, or the Little Clay Cart, Vishakadatta, Mudrakshasa, about Chandragupta Maurya and Chanakya. These dramas often contain nuggets of social history embedded in their plots.
And the technical works.
Hugely important. Kautilya's Arthashastra is a foundational text on statecraft, economics, and administration, giving us an albeit idealized picture of Mauryan-era governance. Then you have scientific works like Aryabhata's Aryabhatya on mathematics and astronomy, or the great medical compendia like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita. These show sophisticated intellectual traditions entirely outside the purely religious sphere.
We also start seeing biographies of kings, which must be read critically, of course,
Yeah.
like Banabhata's Harshatrita.
Right, the Harshatrita, written in the 7th century about King Harsha of Kannauj, is considered the earliest surviving example of historical biography in Sanskrit. Banapada was Harsha's court poet, so naturally the work is highly eulogistic. It's designed to praise his patron.
So you have to sift through the praise to find the history.
You do. But it still provides a narrative framework for Harsha's reign, details about his family, his campaigns, and sometimes the most revealing parts are the incidental details. For instance, Bana includes a fascinating autobiographical sketch of his own youth before he joined the court. He describes traveling around with this incredibly diverse group of companions.
Who was in this entourage?
Oh, it's amazing. He lists poets, musicians, philosophers, ascetics of various sects, a snake charmer, a gambler, artisans, even a dancing girl. It's this colorful entourage, as historians often call it.
That little sketch gives a brilliant snapshot, doesn't it? A world much more mobile and mixed than the rigid social hierarchies often presented in the law books.
Absolutely. It shows the vibrancy and complexity of real life that often gets smoothed over in the more formal texts. It reminds us that alongside the courtly traditions and lineage-based records, Vamshas in the Puranas, songs of bards like Suttas and Abhadas, there was this whole other world of wandering intellectuals and performers.
Okay, one last major category of literary sources. Accounts by foreign writers. These offer an outside perspective.
Yes, and they are incredibly valuable for cross-checking information found in Indian sources, and sometimes for providing information simply not available anywhere else. But their reliability varies wildly.
Who are some of the key early ones?
You have early Greek writers. Ctesias, in the 4th century BCE, wrote about India, but his work is full of bizarre fantasies and hearsay. Much more important is Megasthenes. Megasthenes was an ambassador from the Seleucid Greek kingdom to the court of Chandragupta Maurya in Pataliputra around 300 BCE. His book, the Indica, sadly doesn't survive intact, but large chunks were quoted by later Greek and Roman authors like Strabo, Arrian, and Pliny. It's our best contemporary description of Mauryan state and society, even if filtered through a Greek lens.
And later Greek and Roman sources are useful for trade.
Very much so. The anonymous Periplus Maris Erythrae, Voyage Around the Erythraean Sea, probably written in the mid-1st century CE, is basically a merchant's handbook describing the sea routes, ports, imports, and exports of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade. Invaluable for economic history.
Then we have the Chinese pilgrims.
Crucial sources, especially for the history of Buddhism in India. The two most famous are Faxian, or Fahin, who traveled in India between 399 and 414 CE during the Gupta period, and Xuanzang, or Xuanzang, who made an epic journey between 629 and 645 CE during the time of King Harsha. They came seeking authentic Buddhist scriptures and teachings and to visit sacred sites. Their detailed travelogues describe the condition of Buddhist monasteries, the prevalence of different schools of thought, the political situation in the kingdoms they passed through, social customs, and much more. They give us perspectives on regions and topics sometimes poorly documented in Indian sources.
And finally, a truly pivotal figure for historians, al-Biruni.
Al-Biruni, an 11th century scholar from Central Asia who came to India with Mahmud of Ghazni. He was a polymath interested in everything. He learned Sanskrit and wrote an astonishingly detailed and objective account of India called the Taki Hind, or Inquiry into India. He covered Indian religions, philosophy, sciences, especially mathematics and astronomy, geography, social customs, festivals, and critically for us, scripts and chronology.
How did he help with chronology? That's always a challenge.
He did something incredibly important. He managed to correlate the Indian calendrical eras he learned about with the eras used in the Islamic world. Specifically, he related the beginning of the Gupta era, which starts 319-320 CE, to the much better known Shaka era, starting 78 CE. This connection was like finding a Rosetta Stone for dating the whole classical period of Indian history. Modern historians owe him a huge debt for establishing that crucial link.
Wow. And he also described writing materials.
Yes, very meticulously. He noted the difference between the south, where they used palm leaves, tari, cut into strips, and the north and central regions, where they used treated birch bark. He described how they strung the leaves or bark sheets together. He also discussed the scripts, noting the prevalence of Siddhamatrika script in places like Kashmir and Varanasi, which later evolved into Nagari, and mentioning other regional scripts. These detailed, objective observations from an outsider are just priceless.
Okay, let's completely shift gears now. We've talked texts. Now let's get our hands dirty with archaeology, the study of the past through physical, material remains.
Right. Palaces, houses, temples, pottery, tools, weapons, ornaments, bones, seeds, coins, seals, anything tangible left behind by people.
And archaeologists talk about archaeological cultures. What does that mean?
When archaeologists excavate different sites in a region, and they consistently find a similar package or assemblage of material remains, like a specific style of pottery, particular types of tools, similar house plans, maybe certain burial practices, they group these sites together as representing an archaeological culture, like the painted grayware culture we mentioned earlier.
And the key thing for historians
is that these material cultures tend to change much more slowly than political events recorded in texts. A dynasty might rise and fall in 50 years, but the type of pottery people use or the way they build their houses might stay largely the same for centuries. Archaeology tracks these slower, deeper rhythms of life.
So how do archaeologists actually find and study this stuff? It starts with finding a site.
Sites can be found by accident, like a farmer plowing up old pots, or through systematic surveys, using clues from literature or old maps. Aerial photography can reveal patterns of buried walls or ditches invisible on the ground. Often, ancient settlements form mounds, known as tells in some regions. These build up over centuries as people demolish old structures and build new ones on top, and rubbish accumulates. These mounds contain layers of history.
And excavation is about carefully peeling back those layers.
Exactly. The absolute core principle of archaeological excavation is stratigraphy. Understanding the sequence of layers, or strata, the basic rule, known as the law of superposition, is simple. In an undisturbed sequence, the lower layers were deposited earlier and are therefore older than the upper layers.
Like a layer cake of time?
Precisely. Each layer represents a period of occupation or activity, and the artifacts found within that layer belong to that period. The goal is to excavate layer by layer, meticulously recording the exact position, the provenience of every significant find and feature.
But we have to remember what survives, right? The record isn't complete.
Far from it. There's a huge preservation bias. Inorganic materials, things like stone, fired clay, pottery is crucial for this reason, glass, and most metals tend to survive well in many conditions. But organic materials, wood, textiles, leather, basketry, food remains, unburnt bone decay rapidly, especially in warm, humid, acidic soils like those found in much of South Asia. So the picture we get is always skewed towards the things that happen to last.
Let's make this concrete. You mentioned the excavation at Hastinapura earlier. Can you walk us through that sequence again, showing the layers?
Sure. The excavations there in the early 1950s, led by B.B. Lal, revealed a clear sequence of occupation, separated by periods of abandonment or destruction. Period 1, the earliest, dated before 1200 BCE, contained a type of pottery called ochre-colored pottery, OCP. This pottery is often found at other sites in association with copper tools, part of what's called the copper hoard culture. Then there was a break. Period 2, dated roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, saw the arrival of the painted grayware, PGW people.
The ones we linked tentatively to the Mahabharata period.
That's the connection Lal made, yes. This layer had the distinctive gray pottery with black painted designs, houses made of mud or mud brick, bones of domesticated animals like horse, cattle, pig, and importantly, in the upper levels of period 2, evidence of ironworking, specifically iron slag. This marks the beginning of the Iron Age in this region.
And period 2 ended dramatically.
Yes, the excavation showed clear evidence of a massive flood that destroyed the PGW settlement. This corresponds remarkably well with Puranic traditions about Hastinapura being washed away by the Ganga, forcing the Kuru lineage to shift their capital. After the flood, the site seems to have been largely abandoned for centuries. Period 3 had Norden black polished ware, NBPW, characteristic of the Mauryan period, but the main reoccupation came in period 4. Period 4, dated roughly early 2nd century BCE to the late 3rd century CE, showed a return to urban life. Proper houses built with burnt bricks, drains, terracotta figurines, and significantly, coins, including imitation coins of the Kushana king Vasudeva.
So that sequence, OCP, break, PD rarely iron, flood, break, NBPW, break, burnt brick, tells a story written in the ground over almost 1,500 years.
Exactly. It shows continuity, disruption, technological change, and external connections all through the stratified material remains.
Now, how do we get those dates like 1100 to 800 BCE? That comes from scientific dating methods, primarily carbon-14.
Yes, carbon-14, or radiocarbon dating, revolutionized archaeology. It was developed by Willard Libby in the late 1940s. It works because cosmic rays create a radioactive isotope of carbon, carbon-14, in the atmosphere. Living organisms, plants through photosynthesis, animals by eating plants, absorb this C14 along with regular carbon, C12, in a relatively constant ratio.
But when the organism dies,
It stops taking in new carbon. The regular C12 just stays there, but the radioactive C14 starts to decay at a known constant rate. Its half-life is about 5,730 years.
meaning half of the C14 atoms in the sample will decay into nitrogen-14 in that time.
Exactly. So, by measuring the ratio of remaining C14 to stable C12 in an organic sample like charcoal from a hearth, a wooden post, a bone, seeds, even old textiles if they survive, scientists can calculate how long it's been since that organism died.
How far back can it date things?
It's effective for materials up to about 50,000 years old, maybe a bit more with advanced techniques like accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, which can date tiny samples. After that, there's too little C14 left to measure accurately.
But you mentioned it gives a range, not a precise year.
Correct. Radiocarbon dates are always statistical probabilities. They're usually expressed as years before present, BP, where present is conventionally set at 1950 with a plus or minus error margin, like 3,000 minus 50 BP. And crucially, we now know the amount of C14 in the atmosphere hasn't been perfectly constant over time. Things like changes in the Earth's magnetic field and solar activity affect its production.
So the raw C14 date needs adjusting.
Yes, it needs to be calibrated. We use long, continuous tree ring sequences, dendrochronology, where we know the exact calendar year for each ring, and we measure the C14 in those rings. This allows us to create calibration curves that convert the raw radiocarbon years into much more accurate calendar date ranges, like BCE-CE or BC-AD.
Are there other dating methods archaeologists use?
Oh yes. Thermoluminescence, TL dating, is useful for pottery or burnt flint. It measures the accumulated radiation dose since the material was last heated to a high temperature. Potassium-argon dating can date volcanic rock, essential for early human evolution sites which are millions of years old. Dendrochronology itself, where tree ring patterns overlap, can give exact calendar years in regions where old wood preserves well.
Beyond just dating, science is helping extract incredible details about past lifestyles now, fields like archaeometry and bioarchaeology.
Absolutely. Archaeometry is the application of physical and chemical sciences to archaeological materials. For example, chemical analysis of pottery clay can help pinpoint where it was made, revealing trade patterns. Analyzing the composition of metal artifacts can tell us about ancient smelting techniques and ore sources. Bioarchaeology focuses on biological remains. Studying animal bones, faunal analysis, tells us about diet, hunting practices, animal domestication, even climate. Analyzing plant remains like seeds and pollen, paleoethnobotany, reconstructs past environments in agriculture. Studying human skeletal remains reveals information about diet, disease, injuries, physical activity, and population relationships.
You had that amazing soil analysis example from Inamgaon.
Yes, that's a classic. Inamgaon is a Chalcolithic site, Copper Stone Age in Maharashtra. Archaeologists there noticed different soil colorations and textures. They decided to do chemical analysis, specifically measuring phosphate levels.
Why phosphate?
Because animal dung and urine are very high in phosphates. They found significantly higher phosphate concentrations in the soil of the open courtyards of the houses compared to the soil inside the houses. Meaning the people were likely keeping their animals, cattle, sheep, goats, penned up in the courtyards at night, rather than inside the houses themselves. A simple soil test revealed a specific detail about daily animal management practices thousands of years ago.
That's just brilliant, getting that level of detail from dirt.
An ensonal analysis at the same site, in Namgan, revealed something else fascinating. They found bones of marine fish.
But Inangan is way inland, isn't it? Hundreds of kilometers from the coast.
Exactly. Finding marine fish bones there provides concrete evidence of long-distance trade or contact networks connecting this inland agricultural community with coastal populations. Things they wouldn't have written down, but the bones tell a story.
So archaeology gives us this anonymous history, not about famous kings or battles, but about how ordinary people lived, what they ate, how society was organized.
That's often its greatest strength. It reveals the long-term structures and processes of daily life, technology, settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, the things that affected everyone, not just the elites who wrote the texts.
And to help interpret these material patterns, archaeologists sometimes look at living communities, ethnoarchaeology.
Yes, that's become increasingly important. Ethnoarchaeology is studying traditional technologies, social practices, or site formation processes in living societies to create analogies that might help us understand similar patterns in the archaeological record. For instance, studying how traditional potters in India make, use, and discard their pots today can give us insights into interpreting ancient pottery assemblages. Or watching how modern hunter-gatherers butcher an animal can help interpret cut marks found on ancient animal bones.
A famous Indian example is bead making.
Right. Archaeologists studying the incredibly sophisticated carnelian bead production of the Harappan civilization gained valuable insights by observing traditional agate bead makers still working in Kembe in Gujarat today. Seeing their tools, techniques, workshops, and the waste products they generate helps interpret the finds from Harappan sites like Lothal or Chanhudaro.
And even something as common as pottery. Changes in style aren't just random fashion.
Rarely. Pottery is generally conservative. Significant changes in shapes, fabrics, or decoration often reflect underlying socioeconomic changes. Maybe new cooking methods because of different crops, new types of vessels needed for trade or ritual, changes in social status being expressed through tableware. Archaeologists try to link pottery changes to broader shifts in society. The pots talk, if you know how to listen.
Okay, now we arrive at the sources that bridge the gap we started with, the ones that are both material objects and texts. First up, epigraphy.
Epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. Basically, writing engraved or inscribed onto durable surfaces like stone, metal, copper plates are very common for land grants, terracotta, shells, ivory, even coins, which leads us to numismatics.
And tied closely to epigraphy is paleography.
Yes, paleography is the specialized study of ancient writing systems themselves, how the shapes of letters evolved over time, the direction of writing, abbreviations used. It's essential for dating inscriptions that don't contain an explicit date.
Now, in India, the earliest writing we find is the Harappan script,
which remains famously undeciphered. It's one of the great mysteries. We have thousands of short inscriptions, mostly on seals, but no consensus on what language it represents or how the script works.
So the oldest inscriptions we can read date from much later.
Yes, the oldest deciphered inscriptions date from the Mauryan period, mainly the edicts of Emperor Ashoka from the 3rd century BCE. These are written in two scripts, Brahmi and Kharosthi.
And critically, there's no obvious connection between the Harappan signs and these later scripts.
None that has been convincingly demonstrated. There's a gap of over 1,000 years between the end of the Harappan civilization and the appearance of Brahmi and Kharosthi. Where writing was, or if it existed, during that long interval is unknown.
The story of deciphering Brahmi is a real triumph of scholarship, isn't it? James Prinsep.
Absolutely. James Prinsep, an official of the British East India Company working at the Calcutta Mint in the 1830s, made the crucial breakthrough. It was incredibly painstaking work. He had access to numerous Ashokan inscriptions from pillars and rocks across India, many copied by colleagues. He noticed that many short inscriptions, often donative ones on monuments like Sanchi Stupa, ended with the same two characters. He correctly guessed these represented a standard formula, probably meaning gift of so-and-so. By comparing recurring characters in different short inscriptions and making logical deductions about common names or titles, he gradually managed to assign phonetic values to most of the Brahmi letters. By 1837, he could read the script.
And that unlocked Ashoka's edicts.
Yes, but there was another puzzle. The edicts didn't mention the name Ashoka. They referred to the king as Devanam Piya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks on with favor.
So how do they connect Piyadasi to Ashoka?
That connection came slightly later, primarily through comparing the edicts with Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicles like the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa. These texts explicitly stated that the great Mauryan king Ashoka was also known as Piyadasi. The puzzle pieces clicked into place.
What about the other scripts, Kharosthi? Was that harder or easier to decipher?
Kharosthi turned out to be somewhat easier, mainly because it appeared on bilingual coins.
Ah, coins issued by
the Indo-Greek kings who ruled in northwest India and Bactria, modern Afghanistan, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. These kings issued beautiful coins that often had Greek script on one side, the obverse, and Kharosthi script on the other, the reverse, usually giving the king's name and titles in both languages.
a ready-made Rosetta Stone.
Essentially, yes. Scholars who could read Greek could use the king's names to figure out the phonetic values of the Kharosthi characters. It helped that Kharosthi, unlike Brahmi, was clearly derived from the Aramaic script used in the Persian Empire, which was already known.
And how do these two scripts differ in usage?
Kharosthi was written from right to left, like Aramaic. Its use was largely confined to the northwestern part of the subcontinent, modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia. It seems to have died out around the 3rd century CE. Brahmi, on the other hand, was written from left to right. Its origins are still debated. Some link it to Aramaic or other Semitic scripts. Others argue for an independent indigenous origin, perhaps even distantly related to the Harappan script, though proof is lacking.
But Brahmi had a much bigger future.
Immense. Brahmi is the mother script of almost all later indigenous scripts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and even parts of East Asia. It evolved into the Gupta script, which then gave rise to Nagari, the ancestor of Devanagari, used for Hindi, Sanskrit, Marathi, etc., Siddhamatrika, and numerous regional scripts like Tamil Brahmi, which adapted Brahmi for the Tamil language, Kannada, Telugu, Bengali, Tibetan. Its legacy is enormous.
Okay, so once we can read them, how do inscriptions function as historical records? What makes them so valuable?
Several things. First, they are generally contemporary to the events or donations they record, unlike literary texts, which might be copied centuries later with alterations. Second, they are often precisely dated, either by the regnal year of a king or by reference to a specific known era like the Vikrama era, starting 57 BCE, the Shaka era, 78 CE, or the Gupta era, 319 to 20 CE. Undated inscriptions can often be dated approximately based on the style of the script, paleography.
What kind of information do they contain?
A huge variety. We classify them broadly. There are official inscriptions, like Ashoka's edicts proclaiming his policies, or royal land grants detailing donations of land to brahmanas or temples, often listing genealogies and administrative officials. Then there are private inscriptions, recording donations made by ordinary people, merchants, guilds, monks, nuns, to religious institutions. These often mention professions and family relationships. There are also commemorative inscriptions, marking the construction of a temple, a reservoir, or a heroic act.
You mentioned the Junagadh rock earlier as a prime example of inscriptions telling a long-term story.
Yes, it's perfect. This large rock outcrop in Gujarat has inscriptions from 3 different rulers spanning almost 800 years, all related to the same public work. The Sudarshana Lake, an artificial reservoir. The first inscription tells us the lake was initially commissioned by a governor for the Mauryan Emperor Chandragupta, late 4th C BCE. The second is one of Ashoka's major rock edicts, mid-3rd C BCE, confirming Mauryan control. The third and most detailed is from the Shaka Mahakshatrapa Rudradamandavrost, dated to 150 CE. It's famous for being one of the earliest long inscriptions in classical Sanskrit. It records how the lake's dam burst during a terrible storm and how Rudradaman, against the advice of his ministers who thought it too expensive, repaired it using his own funds. It even names the Mauryan governors from centuries earlier.
And there's a fourth one, too.
Yes. A later inscription from the Gupta Emperor Skandagupta, mid-5th CCE, records yet another repair needed after the dam burst again. So that one rock preserves a nearly 800-year history of this crucial water management project and the succession of empires controlling the region. It's history carved in stone.
Inscriptions also give us those incredibly personal touches sometimes, don't they? Memorials.
They do. We find numerous memorial stones, often called hero stones, viragals in some regions, or chaya stampas, literally shadow pillars, commemorating warriors who died in battle, women who committed sati, or local heroes. But sometimes they commemorate more unusual figures. There's a famous inscription for a hunting dog named Punesha, praising its loyalty, and that absolutely unique 12th century inscription from Karnataka.
The King and the Parrot.
Yes. It records the tragic story of a Kadamba king who apparently performed ritual suicide, Salakana, because he was so overcome with grief after his beloved pet parrot was killed by a cat.
That's just human, isn't
Yeah.
it? Tragic, maybe slightly absurd by our standards, but profoundly relatable emotional depth from 900 years ago.
Exactly. It cuts through the centuries. It reminds us these were real people with intense emotions. That's a kind of history, the history of feeling, that rarely makes it into the official chronicles.
So overall, the advantages of inscriptions are their durability, their contemporaneity, and the fact they often reflect actual practice, not just ideals.
Precisely. And their geographical distribution can often indicate the extent of a kingdom's political influence, although you have to be careful, as smaller inscriptions on movable objects could travel.
Okay, let's turn to the other text-object hybrid, numismatics, the study of coins.
Coins are fascinating. They are official documents, economic tools, and often miniature works of art, all rolled into one. A coin is generally defined as a piece of metal issued by an authority with a standardized weight and purity and bearing marks or designs that guarantee its value.
And the study starts with the basics weight.
Metrology, the study of weights and measures, is key. Ancient Indian weight systems were often based on natural seeds, like the tiny red and black ractica or ratty seed, Abrus precatorius. Standard coin weights were multiples or fractions of these seed weights. By carefully weighing large numbers of coins from hoards, numismatists can establish the weight standards used, track debasement, reduction in weight or purity over time, and even arrange hoards chronologically based on the degree of wear and tear on the coins. Older coins in a hoard will generally be more worn.
What were the earliest coins in India like? Before coins, it was barter.
Presumably barter or exchange using commodities like cattle or grain. The earliest true coins, emerging probably around the 6th century BCE, coinciding with urbanization and the rise of states, are punch-marked coins, PMP.
Punch-marked. Why that name?
Because they were made by taking small, often irregularly shaped pieces of metal, mostly silver, and stamping them with various symbols using individual punches or dies. They weren't struck between two dies like later coins. They typically have multiple symbols, animals, plants, geometric shapes, sun crescent, punched seemingly randomly onto one side. Critically, they have no legends, no writing, no king's name. But they circulated very widely across India for centuries until the early centuries CE.
What came next? Or alongside them?
Alongside PMP, especially from the Mauryan period onwards, we find uninscribed cast coins, mostly copper or copper alloys. These were made by pouring molten metal into terracotta molds. We've even found molds, like a bronze one from Iran. But the big change came with external influence, particularly the Indo-Greeks in the northwest around the 2nd, 1st centuries BCE.
We mentioned their coins helped decipher Kharosthi. What else was special about them?
They introduced the tradition of die striking, producing well-shaped, round coins struck between two engraved dies. And crucially, their coins bear legends, usually in two scripts. They typically have a realistic portrait of the king on the obverse front, with his name and titles in Greek, and on the reverse back, often a deity or symbol with the same information repeated in Prakrit language using the Kharosthi script. Coins of kings like Menander or Strato R are beautiful examples. This set a new standard.
And after the Indo-Greeks, The Kushanas.
The Kushanas, who ruled a vast empire covering parts of Central Asia and northwest India and the Gangetic Basin from the 1st to 4th centuries CE, were hugely important for coinage. They were the first dynasty in India to issue large quantities of gold coins on a regular basis, often called dinaras, probably influenced by Roman gold currency flowing in through trade. They also issued abundant copper coins for everyday transactions.
And the designs on Kushana coins are interesting.
Very much so. The obverse usually shows the Kushana king, often standing and making an offering at a fire altar. But the reverse sides depict an incredibly diverse range of deities, figures from Greek, Helioselene, Iranian, Mithra, Nana, Brahmanical, Shiva, Skandakumara, and Buddhist, Buddha, Maitreya traditions. It reflects the multi-ethnic, multi-religious nature of their empire.
Then came the Guptas, known for their gold coins too.
Yes, the Gupta dynasty, c. 4th, 6th CCE, issued arguably the most beautiful coins in ancient India. They continued the Kushana tradition of gold coinage but refined it, with superb artistic execution and, significantly, legends written in metrical Sanskrit verse. The coin types often provide biographical hints or reflect royal ideology. We see Samudragupta depicted playing the veena, lute, suggesting his cultural accomplishments. Chandragupta coins commemorate his marriage to the Lichavi princess Kumaradevi, highlighting a key political alliance. Kumarupta issued coins showing him hunting lions or rhinoceroses, emphasizing his kingly prowess.
Coins can also show political conflict quite directly, can't they? The Jogulthembi hoard example.
That's a fantastic case study. In 1906, a huge hoard of silver coins was found at Jogulthembi in Maharashtra. It contained 13,250 coins, almost all originally issued by Nahapana, a powerful king of the western Shakas, who ruled in western India around the early 2nd century CE.
But there was a twist.
Yeah, major twist. Out of those 13,250 coins of Nahapana, a staggering 9,270 had been counterstruck or restruck by his great rival, Gautamiputra Satakarni, the Satavahana king who defeated him.
What does counterstriking involve? Stamping over the original design.
Exactly. Gautamiputra Satakarni took Nahapana's coins, which were already circulating, and stamped his own symbols, like the Satavahana Chaitya or hill symbol and the Ujjain symbol, directly over Nahapana's portrait and titles.
Why do that instead of melting them down and making new coins?
It tells us several things. First, it's a very graphic assertion of victory and sovereignty, literally defacing the defeated enemy's currency and replacing it with your own mark. Second, it was probably much quicker and cheaper than collecting, melting, and reminting thousands of coins. Third, and perhaps most importantly from an economic perspective, by restriking existing coins whose weight and silver purity were already trusted by the public, the new ruler could quickly establish a reliable medium of exchange in the newly conquered territory. It maintains some continuity while clearly signaling the change in authority. It's evidence of a sophisticated approach to managing currency transition after conquest.
So coins are packed with information trade networks, like Roman coins found in South India indicating maritime trade.
Yes, thousands of Roman gold and silver coins, mostly from the early centuries CE, have been found in South India, testifying to the massive trade in spices, textiles, and luxury goods.
Religious preferences of rulers from the deities depicted.
Like the Kushana pantheon we discussed, or Gupta kings often depicting Lakshmi or Garuda, reflecting their Vaishnava leanings.
And even economic conditions.
Definitely. When we see the gold content of Gupta coins declining significantly in the later period, it's a strong indicator of economic stress, perhaps due to disruptions in trade or costly wars. Similarly, the widespread use of cowrie shells for small transactions in some early medieval periods suggests a shortage or decline in metal currency for everyday use. Coins provide hard data on the economic pulse of the past. #tag outro. So when you put it all together, you see that reconstructing ancient history isn't about finding one magic source. It's about this constant, meticulous process of correlation. You're weaving together threads from all these different kinds of evidence, the philosophical ideas or narratives from literary texts, the slow material patterns from archaeology, the precise dating and official records from inscriptions, the economic and political clues from coins.
And trying to make them speak to each other, which must be incredibly challenging given how different they are. Integrating, say, a philosophical text about the ideal society with the evidence of what pots people were actually using.
That's the core challenge, absolutely. How do you map the event-focused, often elite-biased, sometimes idealized world of the texts onto the anonymous, slow-changing, materially grounded world revealed by archaeology? There are always gaps, always tensions. It requires both rigorous analysis and, frankly, a degree of creative, disciplined imagination.
And the story is never fully told, is it? Because the evidence itself keeps changing.
Exactly. New sites are found, new techniques are developed, old texts are reinterpreted.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We've covered a huge amount of ground today, looking at the diverse sources historians use. But the overwhelming feeling, perhaps, should be one of potential. Think about those thousands of unread palm leaf manuscripts sitting in archives. Think about the countless archaeological mounds across South Asia that remain completely unexcavated. The past isn't just history, it's also potential discovery.
It's waiting there, in those unread texts, in those undisturbed layers of earth, waiting for new questions, new methods, new interpretations.
So the provocative question to leave you with is this: what crucial piece of the puzzle? What hidden historical truth about ancient India might be lying dormant right now, just waiting for the right person or the right technology to finally bring it into the light? Well,